On August 18th, 1590, 3 years after he had last been able to reach the area, John White discovered that the colony he had briefly ruins and two separate messages written on trees pointed to the Native American tribe of Croatan as a possible clue of their current whereabouts. Investigating further, White attempted to discover where the people had gone. But when the ship he had chartered suffered damage to one of its anchor cables, the ship's captain ordered them away, leaving them with far more questions than answers. What had happened to the first English colonists of North America? Had they been invaded by a foreign power? Was there dissension from within that had led to civil war? Or is there a more paranormal or extranormal explanation for what happened on Roanoke Island? Here we have one of the most compelling mysteries of history, in the complete disappearance of the colonists of Roanoke Island, which we will be discussing tonight on Friday Night Frights. I'm your host, Christian Ashley of Systematic Ecology, here to terrify and instruct you all on the weird, fantastical, unusual, and I've already messed up my intro. Let me start over. Here to terrify and instruct you all on the weird, unusual, fascinating, fantastical, and unexplainable things that may or may not lurk out there in the world. Now, you may notice I am alone today. That is because Joe, unfortunately, was not able to join me here. He had an incredibly busy week working in ministry and some personal matters as well. So just send your prayers and thanks his way. I'm very grateful for him. I myself did not exactly have the easiest of weeks. This was supposed to be done last week, but I decided to postpone it. And yeah, even this week wasn't that much of a relief, but I'm here. We're going to get stuff done. We're going to have fun. And I'm glad to have you guys here with me. So, just as a reminder, our schedule is to, once a month, cover one of six categories: cryptozoology, the paranormal, religious strangeness, the weird and the unexplained, true crime, and ufology. Now, as a bit of an announcement for those who are unaware, you can find Friday Night Frights available in podcast form, part of the Anazal Ministries podcasting network. It will be as unedited as our initial YouTube broadcast always will be, and will release the Friday after we initially record, unless we do so on the last Friday of the month, which means I'll do my best to upload the file that night. So, just a way to try and attract more listeners this way. We already have the audio files for it. Might as well do it. So, there we go. So, if any of that interests you, check out the podcast forum. Or if you're on a podcast, you're interested about the YouTube, head that way. Now, you may notice we are out of sync with the normal schedule. That being because Joe, as we mentioned last time, wanted to do more of the religious strangeness stuff for the month of October, that of course being around Halloween. So we'll be doing exorcisms then. That's that. So we'll just get into this bad boy. The lost colony of Roanoke has been one of those things that, especially growing up in North Carolina, as I did, it's just something you kind of learn. It's just a matter of fact. It was, hey, when you're learning your state history, mandated by, whatever, whoever governs the education system there, which needs some work, but that's its own issue. You learn at some point in time about the lost colony of Roanoke. And it's a huge part of a North Carolinian heritage to, proudly say, hey, we were one of the first. And we don't know what happened to them. They were there one moment and then just gone the next. So my personal history with this, of course, learning it in school and being the kid that I was always looking up mysteries of history, cryptozoology, all this. You guys know this. So I was baffled as a kid, wondering, okay, just like everyone else before me, like there were people here and now they're gone. How is this possible? And as you grow up, you start learning more things. It's like, it took forever for people to get in between England and the colonies. So no wonder there was this immense amount of time where we just don't know what happens, especially with stuff like the Spanish Armada happening at that time and John White not being able to come back to learn what had happened to the colonists. It's just one of those things that you have to accept that we just don't know because the information is limited to us. Now, that doesn't mean we can't attempt to answer the issue. And that's going to be part of what we're doing tonight. I say we like Joe is here. I'm speaking here the royal we, of course, because I myself am just so majestic and royal. Anyways, this story is one of those things that matters to me, not only because of my heritage, but also because it's a mystery and I can't stand for there not to be an answer. And as has been said many times before, I want to know these things. I want to look at them and figure out what is going on. How can we figure this out? There were people there and now they're not. What is the answer? Well, we're going to be looking into that. Now, as a part of doing all that, we first need to set a couple, uh, ground rules of what's going on here. This, of course, in the 1580s is primarily where we'll be staying until we get to the 1590. And for those of you on YouTube, you can see an image of Roanoke Island itself. It's actually a very beautiful spot of Manteo. That area, I've been there before a couple of times. Once a year, me and some old college buddies, we head over to the Outer Banks for a week just to hang out and reconnect and have fun with one another. It's a really enjoyable time, very rewarding time. Something I desperately need at times to just get away from everything. So, obviously, we'll pass through this area. We'll hear a little more about. We've been on some ghost tours and stuff like that that talk about the island. It's a mysterious disappearance, and unfortunately, we go to time of the year when there's not many people around, so not everything's open. So we don't get to explore everything we'd like to. But that's that. But Roanoke Island itself, not only is it a beautiful location, but just the general sense of, oh man, I'm in a location right here where weirder things happen, where something outside the norm happened. So what am I going to do with that information? Well, most people just move on with their lives. But for the purposes of the night, we're not going to do that. We're going to be focusing on what happened here. Now, to do that, let's look at the history of this place. Obviously, it was settled multiple times over by different Native American tribes um, until the colonists came over. But for the European side of things, we start in the year 1584-ish, yes, where under the direction of Queen Elizabeth I, Sir Walter Raleigh, of which Raleigh, North Carolina is named after, began the plans that would lead to the colonization of Roanoke Island, which the English hoped to settle as a means not only of claiming land that Spain and other nations like France and Portugal and the like would one day hope to seize if they didn't act first. Now, this is at a time where England is starting to become a little more of a naval power. They're starting to grow in strength a little bit. Because historically, the Spaniards were pretty much the people you had to deal with if you wanted to go find out this mysterious new world that was appearing to the Europeans for the first time ever since Columbus swung by in 1492. They became aware of something that the Vikings had known about since what, like a thousand AD, I think, when he discovered Leif Erikson discovered Greenland, and then from there Vinland and stuff like that. So looking at this, it makes perfect sense for a developing nation like England to want to be a world power to seek out a slice of that land for themselves. Now, the arguments about colonialism and all that, we're not going to get in that today. Obviously, very terrible things happen as a result of it. I'm not here to justify that. We're just talking from their perspective why they would want to do this thing, why they would want a slice of the pie, a slice of the cake for themselves, because they think, not knowing how large America is, that they're going to get access to the West Indies so that they can get the supplies that they can't get because of Muslim nations controlling the trade routes to the Silk Road and so on for China and India. So if we go this way instead, oh, that's perfect. But of course, now that we can look back and go, well, they got it wrong. Well, it's not their fault they got it wrong. They did not see the Earth as we do. They don't have satellites and everything. Ain't their fault. But for them, it was make perfect sense. Not only could they do that, but they could also use it to be designed as a base and staging area for privateering raids against the Spanish colonies to the south. If you don't know what privateering is, it's legalized piracy. Sure, yeah. Let's go with that one. It's legalized piracy, where You would go to another foreign nation. You would be, your privateers would say, be English background or Spanish or Portuguese or what have you, French. And they would come in. They saw a different nation's flag. Okay, we're going to go assault that ship. We're going to take their loot. And we may leave the ship alive and the people alive. We may not. Depends on how we're feeling. And then they would return that back home and they'd be heralded as heroes because they fought against a foreign nation. They didn't start a war, but they got to reap what someone else had worked on and enrich their own nation. Now, obviously, because of this, there are huge issues between nations because, well, you stole something that we rightfully obtained. And once again, removing colonialism for a bit, what they rightfully stole as well from other people. So this friction that exists here is the one-upsmanship that always occurs in global politics of, well, you've got this, now I want that. So how am I going to get there? Well, I got to upend you. I've got to make a presence in that land you're at. Well, the Spanish had already explored the Southern Americas at this time. They had set up forts in Florida, and of course the different Caribbean islands, South America. Portugal had taken over, was Brazil now. There's plenty there that they didn't get to yet, though. The Spanish had explored parts of this area and, in fact, had made contact with some of the native tribes in the area, but they hadn't made a settlement there yet. So the British, seeing this, decided they're going to do it first. Now, in the year 1584, Sir Walter Raleigh commissioned Philip Armidas, and I think I'm pronouncing that right, and Arthur Barlow to find a place to set up such a colony and base, knowing it needed to be strategic, knowing it needed to have some natural defenses to it, knowing it needed to be in an area where, hey, guess what? We don't want the Spanish to take it from us. So find the best spot for it, one where we can not only have a suitable base, but a place where people can actually live and settle the land. So they traveled across the Atlantic and the coast of the Americas to regions like Cape Fear and the Outer Banks, and eventually to Roanoke Island proper. There they made contact with some of the tribes native to the region, including the Secotan, I think I'm saying that right, and the Croatan tribe. Uh, we'll get into the Croatan versus Croatoan later on. I'm going to focus more on Croatan because I think that's the primary way of spelling it today. But yeah, if I'm wrong, please feel free to correct me down low in the comments. I'm always willing to have constructive criticism thrown my way if I didn't get something right. So at this point in time, they established initially friendly ties with these tribes. There was even, I can't remember if it's this journey, the next one, where two of them, one from each tribe, individuals came with them to England to, cross pollinate, cultures and stuff like that. So starting off, compared to everything else, fairly well. Then, when they returned from this mission, soon after this, they reported their success to Queen Elizabeth I, with Raleigh kind of shall we say, spicing things up by trying to make it seem like Roanoke Island was a new Garden of Eden, which, hey, he's a salesman. That's what they do. So I can't fault him for that, really. But at the same time, he knew exactly what he was doing. Whatever it takes to get Queen Elizabeth I to give him the money and the deed to that land where he could rule over it, he did. And that's exactly what she did. She gave an executive order to where he, Walter Raleigh, could control that area, not as the governor, kind of like above them in that sense, but he would be the noble in charge of that region. But he had to get a colony made there and established before 1591. Otherwise, uh, the deal that he had made with her would run out, which 7 years, that's a long time to get something done. So I think that's initially incredibly fair for her to do so. So, in light of this, Raleigh had to go out and figure out what to do to organize things. Then, a year later, 1585, under the direction of Ralph Lane, who was to be the first governor of the colony, who would report back to Raleigh, who would report back to Queen Elizabeth I, we saw 600 men, half of whom were to become colonists, set out from England and settle the area. Now, the rest of them in there, I think, were just part of the ships that were used there as like 3 or 4. I should have written that down. It's on me. Now, however, when they got there, they started off okay. They, re-talked, re-engaged talks with the native tribes of the area. There was, of course, disputes and stuff like that, but initially they were fine. They had made a fort to live in. They were starting to see if they could mine the area, and of course, they found no silver and gold, but they did find some of the natural riches of the area and attempt to make some crops. But in the process of all this, due to immense strife in the region from the weather, the loss of supplies from the ship, I believe, yeah, the Tiger was the name of that ship, their failure to grow their crops well, and a breaking in ties with natives near them, the group quickly regretted their decision to stay in Roanoke. But they stayed for a bit. They tried to tough it out. The people were sent back for supplies. Initially, they were helped by relief ships led by Francis Drake, another privateer, another man of fortune who would do some despicable things. But I mean, that's the great thing about history is that some people are really great, but they also do really evil things. It's human nature. It's not good, but it is what it is. And that's part of learning and growing up is realizing, oh, those people I idolized, those people I looked up to, those people I thought were good. Well, they're just as human as I am. Now, Francis was doing everything in his power that he was capable of doing to actually support the colony because he saw the immense value of this, even though he wouldn't be the one in charge of anything. But after one of his ships that he had left there, the Francis, uh, which I just realized is that named after him, which I mean, if you're in charge of him, why not? Uh, was that this ship, the Francis, was actually taken away by a hurricane. So they got their first bit of that lovely time in North Carolina where those hurricanes just show up and immense damage is done to anyone in the area. And as a result of this, they knew that they couldn't stay without being supplied further. Like they could have made themselves self sufficient, but they weren't ready. They had overestimated their ability. And it took however many months to get from England to Roanoke and back. So it just wasn't worth the effort that they could produce. And so, reasonably enough, they fled back to England. And as a result, this made the first colony a failure. But it didn't stop them there. There was still a strategic desire for them to go out and settle this land and make sure that the Spaniards couldn't get there first, or the French, or who have you, and make sure that the people would be, supportive of England and their policies and all that. But first come didn't really work out. Next time, though, as he was undeterred by this, Raleigh then he himself was persuaded by men like John White to resettle the area. John White, you remember from earlier in the beginning introduction. And in 1587, a much smaller group of colonists, I believe of like 106-ish or something like that, they were then assembled and they resettled the area near the original settlement, including his pregnant daughter Eleanor, who, gosh, that's a terrible journey overseas. Pregnancy. I feel for you, girl. Now, attempts were made to make peace between the colonists and the native tribes, but they led to some misunderstandings, the cultural differences, the linguistic differences as well. As someone who suffers immensely from trying to learn other languages, thank God I don't have to do Hebrew and Greek anymore, unless I choose to. I get it. And especially languages that have been separated for thousands upon thousands of years, where I grew up and were cultivated in different ways. Of course, attempting to learn the Croatan language or the Secatan language would have been way different than a language like English. So I have immense respect for people who are able to do stuff like that. Now, unfortunately, we'll see that didn't end well. But initially, they attempted to work with alongside each other, but they had a couple people die. One man was killed while he was searching for crabs, and then one of the uh, In response to this and other things, the men attempted to invade the Croatan village, but they had fled. So there was all this stuff happening to where things were just gonna go very, very poorly if smarter heads didn't prevail, wiser heads didn't prevail. Luckily, they did have, providentially, I should say, they did have one of those men, Manteo, who was a native who had accompanied the English earlier from one of their missions there back to England that I mentioned earlier, was able to learn English language and actually talk to the other tribes there, and they were able to settle for a bit, and there was for a time peace. And not everything was bad at this point in time, because as you may or may not have heard, on August 18th of that year, Virginia Dare was born to Eleanor, making her the first English born child in America. Now, why did I qualify it like that? Well, because times have moved on, thank God. And we don't just say she's the first child born there, or even the first white child born there, because even that's wrong. Because, obviously the Native American tribes had lived there for thousands upon thousands of years. They've had many children since then. And she's not even the first white child that was born there because, like I mentioned earlier, the Vikings had settled up north in the Americas, in the region of, I believe, Newfoundland is where Vinland is at. And it had children for a time until they abandoned those colonies and came back to Scandinavia. So that is why I qualify it as I do. I, of course, at the time growing up, was raised, she was the first white child born there. And I mean, that's not even true. But you understand why we kind of change our language around that, especially in today's age. So, in light of that, even in the midst of that beautiful thing happening, because, hey, in a time with infant death was incredibly high, even with skilled doctors around, a child was born and survived on a new land to them and was thriving for a bit. That's incredible. That's a wonderful thing. However, as you get further into this history of what's happening here, things soured once more with a loss of supplies, forcing White to leave so that he could come back with aid for his people as he went over to England. Unfortunately, doing so in the midst of the perils started by the Spanish Armada, which threatened to invade the entire nation. And Elizabeth I had forbidden anyone from leaving England for a time, leaving him stranded for a while. Now, if you don't know what was happening here, like I mentioned earlier, all these different European nations were vying for supremacy, vying for control. And it didn't help that this is in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, England being Protestant, Spain being Spanish. There was a religious tie to the war building up here and the differences between Protestants and Catholics. The Church of England very much not aligned with Catholic faith, so on and so forth. So by thinking that God himself was blessing them, well, one had to be true, the other did not in their point of view. So this was part of them assuring that they were in the right, was by claiming this land for themselves and fighting against one another to say the way we interpret things scripturally is right, the other is not. Now, the Spanish Armada, if you know the story, attempted to invade England, suffered an immense storm that killed many people, destroyed many ships, and then the English Navy was able to successfully ward them off, ending the Spanish invasion of England. But it didn't happen overnight. And the whole time, White was stuck there. Until the next year, where he was eventually able to meet up with Sir Richard Grenville and attempt to go back in 1588. But when they got there to the area of the colony, they couldn't anchor the ship anywhere because the weather was bad and the seas were just so torrential and that they couldn't even attempt to make contact with the people of Roanoke. So And that's assuming that the people were even there at this point in time, because it had been a year since he had been able to go there. And as a result, Grenville kind of made the executive decision to leave the colony behind without making contact, without giving them the supplies that White had fought so hard for. And he himself would not get the ability to come back until 1590. So if you're keeping track, that's 3 full years that he's attempted to go back and save not only the colonists he's responsible for, but also his own family. But finally, as hostilities started to die down, they had grown cold enough to allow other ships to not be needed on the front lines, which is one of the reasons why other ships, even if they themselves were not, military vessels, they were still conscripted to serve. White was finally able to organize a mission, and that's where we started the episode. And from which, as a result of his looking into what happened there, we have countless hypotheses and speculations that have been made over the years to help us understand how a colony of over 100 people simply vanished from the face of the earth. And White wasn't alone in his attempts to figure out what happened. We go all the way back. Sir Walter Raleigh attempted to do that. Now he had a very personal investment in why he wanted to know, given that his charter was about to end up to be in charge of all that area. His last attempt to go there failed as well. And he would later die, if I'm remembering my history correctly, where he was accused of being part of a plot against the king. And obviously after that, you don't really get the chance, because after Elizabeth I died, James I came to power. And that didn't help matters, if I'm remembering my English history correctly, which you can always correct me on if I got that wrong. So what happened here? Where does a colony of over 100 people suddenly just disappear to? And in their survey of the area, they found no mass graves or anything. There were no uh, bones just kind of sticking up out of the ground. There was no sign of war and conflict. It just seemed like one day they just up and left and moved on elsewhere. So let's look at some potential answers to this disappearance. Now, what you see if you're on YouTube is a depiction of, I believe this is supposed to be a representation of a member of the Croatan tribe. These would have been the closest people to him, the Secretans as well, but primarily they dealt with the Croatans. Now, one thing that has been thrown out a lot is the idea that maybe they assimilated with the tribes next to them when they realized they couldn't look after themselves. They gave up their identities, became part of the tribe, and when the years just went by, they intermarried, and no one ever came to look for them because they were just part of the tribe, and no one cared about Roanoke anymore after the decades passed on, which in itself is certainly plausible. And it makes sense tactically. It's like, hey, we're not doing well on our own. You guys know what you're doing. You've actually lived here the whole time. Even with, old sensibilities of racial superiority and the righteousness of, working with God to take over land. If you're desperate enough, you give up on those ideas. So I definitely see this as an idea of what could be happening here. Uh, as I understand it today, the Croatan tribe no longer exists. As far as like being an identity. Now there are some who still have Croatan ancestry from DNA testing that have been done on people, but the tribe itself, there is no reservation, as I understand it. If I got that wrong, once again, please correct me. Now, I promised earlier, Croatan versus Croatoan. On multiple trees, it was either a Croatoan or a crow carved into them. Now, John White saw this as a clue, which naturally makes kind of sense of, oh, that must be where the people went. They left to go to the Croatoans. Other people have taken up the meaning the Croatoans assuming the Croatans, had attacked them, and they were just writing down. It's the classic, "I'm gonna write in my own blood, my murderer's name," or something like that. Maybe. But from what DNA evidence we do have of people who do have Croatan descent, there is some mixing of European ancestry in them. I believe British would be what they would say, but it's not a definitive, as in taking a bullet for it kind of way of saying that's exactly what happened. So, what else could have happened? Foreign invasion. I mean, saw it earlier. The Spanish hated the British. They had had a several decade head start on making bases there and claiming land. And Florida's not terribly far away from the Carolinas. So, could they have come up there and attacked them? Well, it's certainly plausible until you look at Spanish records, which is actually it's really funny too. Looking at what the Spanish had to say about Roanoke, because they thought the British were thriving there. They thought they were setting up naval bases and that they had found like mountains made of gold and silver. May have even found the Fountain of Youth and El Dorado. And from reading some of the diary entries that we do have uh, left behind there, it's incredibly amusing to see one situation, the reality of, yeah, we don't know what happened to them. They all disappeared versus the Spanish going, oh my gosh, they're thriving there. They're going to start an own empire. They're going to kill us all. The contrast between the two I find highly amusing, not with the loss of life, but with the perceptions involved here. So if those sources can be trusted, which I believe we can, because there's very little reason not to claim that they did what if they had invaded the colony and killed the people there or sold them into slavery or something like that. That was just the MO of the day. And they were already fighting a war with England. So why would they need to care about saving face? That's what you do in war. It's not a good thing, but it's what you do in war. So I find that a little less plausible. Now, other people have thrown the French around because, of course, the French ruined everything. It's a claim that they came in, wiped out the colonists, or maybe even tried to blame it on the Spanish. Except the French never claimed any of that happened. So, my personal feelings on the French side, I don't really think that they themselves are actually responsible for what has occurred here. And once again, looking at the fort itself, where these people were living in, there was no sign of places being burnt down or bodies being left somewhere and valuables stolen or anything like that. So if the French did this, if the Spanish did this, or another foreign nation had done this, they were the most effective in the world. They were so highly skilled that they'd make SEAL Team 6 look like a bunch of beginners. I find that highly implausible. So another thing that's brought up is native invasion. Now, this naturally is an idea that sprung up because guess what? They had difficulty getting along with each other. Imagine that. Oh, this place you've lived in for thousands of years. Well, we're going to be here now, too, by the way. That's known as being a bad neighbor, number one, but something that causes friction between two people groups. So, could that have gotten to the point where they were fighting against one another? And the Croatans or Secretans, or maybe another tribe, maybe some people have even thrown the Powhatan tribe of Virginia as someone who may have wiped them out and enslaved them or something like that. But once again, to the archaeological evidence that they found originally and what we have found so far, this seems highly implausible because there's no evidence, there's no real evidence, I should say, hard evidence of this occurring. It's not impossible. Maybe, they had been tricked into a parlay or something like that and then surrounded and then forced to become members of the tribe or something like that. That's a possibility, but yeah, the place would have been ransacked. More things would have been lost that weren't there. So I find this highly suspect, and yeah, at the end of the day, I can't really get behind that yet. Then we have internal strife slash a civil war. What was the reason John White had to leave in the first place? They didn't have the supplies they needed to survive. And he was hoping, however many months to get to England, however many months to get back, to come back in time for the people to be fed, for crops to eventually grow, for them to feel safe. But the months went on, years went on, and there was no sign of relief. So, what are the people supposed to expect? And the speculation here being is that they gave up hope and fought against one another and eventually wiped each other out. Now, as a possibility, once again, this falls under the same scrutiny as what came before. There's no sign of this inner struggle between two factions. Say one family over here decided they should be the leaders now, and the other family over here said we should be leaders. We should be doing this. We should be doing that. Well, I'm gonna kill you now, so we can be in charge. Well, there's very little evidence to suggest that, if at all. So, as a possibility, something that needs to be brought up, but one in which, when you actually explore what's going on there, you kind of, eh, doesn't really hold up a lot of weight at the end of the day. Now, something else people throw out is a failed attempt by them to head back to England. That's exactly what the first colonists had done. There was ships nearby to where they could board them and head back to England. It didn't work out the first time, so they fled. So naturally, people assume maybe they attempted to do that and they were destroyed by a hurricane or lost at sea. Maybe a ship sprung a leak somewhere. A thousand terrible things could have happened to you, especially back in the days of the age of exploration, when your ship could just not work anymore. And there was nothing you could do about it, and you were stuck thousands of miles away from the shore. Well, you kind of boned. So this one, I can get behind a little more than some of the other ones because there's historical precedent for it. And if you're desperate enough, of course you're going to flee. Of course you're going to try and get away. But as far as what we have, there were no larger vessels there that could have ferried them back. I believe a lot of scholars that I've looked at have really debated whether or not they had the wood for it. They definitely could have cut down enough trees for it, but judging by looking at the logs at the time, looking at the woods at the time, and when White was there wasn't enough evidence to suggest a lot of them had cut down to make a ship, which would have taken time, especially when you don't have a shipyard with you. So that does lose a little big of credibility in this idea. So I want to throw that out. Now it's time. Now it's time to get into your more fantastical explanations. And these are legitimate things people have actually brought up to suggest that could have happened to the people living in the colony of Roanoke. That, of course, being, first off, a Bigfoot attack. Now, this is not as implausible as it seems on the surface. The Outer Banks, as I learned doing my research for this, actually have a rich history of seeing Bigfoot-like beings in them. And I believe looking up in the last 5 years, there was a sighting reported. Now, that doesn't mean, obviously, that there was actually a Bigfoot there. Someone does misidentification that could have happened, or someone just making the story up. But if you look into Bigfoot sightings in the area, there's a lot more than you'd expect. But as far as what actually could have happened here, could a bunch of Bigfoot tribe or whatever have actually risen up against the people of Roanoke and attacked them, well, this falls under the same scrutiny as earlier invasion stories would lead. Because, hey, depending on what you believe about Bigfoot, are they human intelligence? Are they just beneath that? Are they more ape like? There are going to be signs of something like this happening. And White's explorations of the area do not suggest that there were giant hominids around clubbing people to death or beating them up with their fists or whatever, depending on whatever the technological capabilities of Bigfoot are. So this one, while I find it very entertaining, I don't actually put a lot of merit inside of. So I did want to do my due diligence in checking that out. And despite finding out more about Bigfoot and the Outer Banks than I ever expected, I can't get behind this one. So next up, mass abduction by UFOs. This would explain many things if an alien crew, single UFO, multiple ones came by, saw the colonists. Why specifically them? Don't worry about it for the sake of the story for a second. And decided those were our targets. They could have easily taken them away, assuming a higher technological race, teleportation, or what have you, matter scrambling, that brings that person to your ship. You just take them away for research or whatever. Now, look, let me preface this with I know how ridiculous it sounds, but this would explain in this, if this were real, is what I'll say. Why suddenly it just looked like people left. It's kind of like the Mary Celeste in that situation of, hey, there were people here 1 second and now they're not. And there's evidence of things that they left behind. So were they leaving in a hurry or something like that? Was because there's no sign of battle. So if there were a UFO, of course, of being able to pass the vast distances of space, uh, might have the technology able to do something like this to leave no trace behind. Sure, I can possibly believe that being the case, but without solid evidence behind it, you will never hear me say the people of Roanoke Island were abducted by aliens because there is no evidence behind it other than the fact that there is a lack of evidence that could suggest in a way, well, it's certainly possible that it happened. So I'm not going to entertain that anymore. And once again, why them? Why specifically them? Out of all the other people around, they specifically chose them alone. It is what it is. So those are the more popular ideas of what could have happened. There are smaller ones out there I didn't bring up, but for the sake of time, let's just move on to a new segment I want to add where we discuss these mysterious things and how they show up in popular culture. We're starting with one of the best with Marvel 1602. This is an alternate reality where Captain America, when he was fighting against the Purple Man who had become the president, was sent backward in time. And as a result of him coming back in time, superheroes start showing up before they're supposed to. And we have, obviously, you see the more Elizabethan style Spider-Man outfit there. You see the X-Men are now the witch breed. Let's see what else. Thor is a Christian minister who doesn't know that he's a god. It's very, very fun things in the story. But as far as the Roanoke side of things go, the colony survives because of what they assume to be a Native American name, Rajas, who, as we find out later on, is Steve Rogers, Captain America, sent back in time, who had joined up with Native American tribes that kind of lost some of his memory, if I remember correctly. Very ironic what I just said, I know, and looked after the people. So they were able to thrive. Now, on that cover that you can see if you're on YouTube, there is a woman's face there, and that is actually Virginia Dare, who, as a result of, I think, touching the portal that brought Cap back in time, gains the ability to change shape into animals. But of course, being kind of our, and it actually ends up in a relationship with Peter Parquag, who is our Spider-Man here, actually ends up staying with him for a bit until she kind of serves the role of Gwen Stacy, and she gets Green Goblin to death. Osborn has his way, and well, yeah, she doesn't last much longer than that, which is a huge waste of her character, mind you. But I mean, Marvel going to do what Marvel going to do. Next up, we have Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter. I have not read the novel. I should preface it with this. I've only seen the movie. But as part of the mythos of this story, which is a very fun one, I might add, vampires are responsible for the death and the loss of the colonists in Roanoke. And Abe's main advisor, Henry, is the last survivor of that group who had actually been turned into a vampire himself by the vampires who attacked them. So the rest of the people were fed upon, and that explains why they disappeared and why there were no survivors except for Henry. And hey, sure, vampire attack didn't really have that on my list of possibilities, but you know, they're real. They could certainly do it. Then we have one of my favorite King stories of all time, especially one that isn't a novel itself. That is Storm of the Century. Takes place in a main island way up north that really only has access by boat to the mainland. And then suddenly this massive storm whips up around them, and a mysterious figure known as Andre Lanoge shows up, and they just asks them, "Hey, give me what I want, and I'll go away." And as we learn more about him, this magician, this more satanic kind of figure, he wants an apprentice. He's lived for hundreds of years, and he wants to pass on that knowledge to someone else. And we learn he made the same set of circumstances happen in Roanoke back in the day, but they refused him. So he forced them all into the sea under magical manipulation. So that explains why there were no bodies left behind. A great miniseries, by the way. I don't want to spoil the ending for you. If you can check it out, well worth your time. But yeah, that's how Roanoke factors into that movie. And that's it for that. So, final judgments. What the heck is happening here? I mean, your guess is as good as mine, is what I'm going to say. But for the sake of having an answer, and one I do think is the closest one to the truth, as close as we're ever going to be able to know, this part of, time and space, this part of eternity, where until we can ask God what's going on, I follow along more with the idea that due to internal strife, the colonists agreed to join up with their Croatan neighbors and assimilated into their culture, having lost all hope that help would arrive and relieve them. But that's what I think. I mean, at the end of the day, am I right? And with that, what do you believe, dear listeners and viewers? Where did the colonists of Roanoke Island go? Were they the victims of an invasion, their own hubris, or perhaps something supernaturally darker? We didn't touch everything that history and folklore have on a subject tonight, so let us know in the comments below if there's something you'd like us to do a follow-up on. In the description below, you can find the sources used for tonight's program. Next time, we'll be moving on to our next category, Religious Strangeness, where Joe and I will be unpacking various exorcisms throughout history and whether or not they truly happened or were never real to begin with. So see you next time.